What would you do if someone used your name, your license, and your reputation to build their own empire, and left you holding the wreckage? Jonah Webb, 28 years old, had spent 6 years building something real, not a startup, not a hedge fund. A licensed electrical contracting business in Millhaven, Ohio, population 6,000, where he'd grown up watching his father rewire farmhouses for cash and a handshake. Jonah had taken that same knowledge, passed his licensing exams on the first try, and at 22 opened Webb and Pruitt Electric with his longtime friend and business partner, Lawrence Pruitt. Lawrence was older by 7 years, smooth in ways Jonah wasn't. He handled the clients, the bids, the county permits. Jonah handled the wire, the breaker panels, the actual work. It was a good arrangement, or so Jonah believed. By the time he was 27, they had a crew of 8 and contracts with 3 school districts and a hospital expansion outside Columbus. They were, by every measure, succeeding. Then, on a Tuesday evening in November, a fire broke out in Crestwood Middle School. A wing of the building burned to the frame. No students were hurt. It was after hours. But the fire marshal's investigation turned up something damning. The electrical wiring in that wing had been installed incorrectly, with substandard materials, and signed off on inspection forms bearing Jonah's signature and license number. Jonah had never set foot in that school's east wing. He had never signed those forms. But the paperwork said otherwise. Lawrence Pruitt, it turned out, had been cutting corners on every public contract they'd won for 4 years. Cheaper wire, cheaper connections, falsified inspection reports. He'd been pocketing the difference. A quiet, patient theft that had run into the hundreds of thousands. And he'd used Jonah's license number to rubber stamp the fraud, betting that if it ever came apart, the paper trail would land on Jonah's doorstep, not his. The bet paid off. Lawrence's personal finances were clean, separated by a shell company his brother-in-law had set up. Jonah's name was on every fraudulent document. The school district sued. The county launched a criminal investigation. His contracting license was suspended pending the outcome. His savings evaporated on legal fees inside 8 months. His lawyer, a decent man who told him the truth, said it plainly. The paperwork is too clean. Someone planned this, and whoever planned it had a very long head start. By spring, the criminal charges were dropped for lack of direct evidence, but the civil liability remained, and the licensing board wasn't reinstating anyone connected to a school fire investigation. At 28, Jonah owned a truck, a set of tools, and $412. He drove south and west with no particular destination, the kind of aimless movement that happens when a person runs out of what to run toward. He crossed into Kentucky, then into Indiana, and eventually, as he pulled off the highway near a small city called Harker's Mill in southern Iowa, where a diner sign advertised 2 eggs and toast for $4 and change. He ate alone, staring out at the flat August sky, and when the waitress refilled his coffee without being asked, he felt something crack inside his chest that he couldn't name. He ended up staying. A weekly rate motor lodge on the edge of town cost him $60 a night. He took day labor when he could find it, hauling grain bags at a co-op, cleaning gutters, pretending his hands didn't know a more precise vocabulary than that. It was on his 5th day in Harker's Mill that he noticed the sign on the county administration building. Tax foreclosure auction. Thursday, 10 a.m. He went inside because the air conditioning worked, and he'd been sleeping in his truck the night before when the lodge payment bounced. The auction room was small, wood-paneled, smelling of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. 12, maybe 15 people sat in folding chairs. Farmers, mostly. A couple of real estate men in polo shirts looking bored. An older woman in the front row who seemed to be there for the company. Jonah sat in the back and listened as parcels moved through. A foreclosed duplex, a strip of agricultural land, an overgrown lot behind the Dollar General. Then the auctioneer, a heavy-set man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. Lot 11, he said. 8 acres, Sycamore Road, south of Harker's Mill. Formerly the site of the Caldwell Grain Company elevator complex, structure partially collapsed in 2019, condemned by County Building Authority. Subsurface water intrusion, not suitable for residential or agricultural development. Opening bid is $3,000. A couple of the farmers chuckled. The polo shirt men didn't even look up. Do I hear 3,000? The Caldwell elevator had been a local landmark once. A concrete grain tower that had served the county for 40 years before a partial foundation failure brought down one side of the structure, and the county condemned what remained. The utility basement beneath the main building had been flooding seasonally for years. Nobody wanted it. The county had been trying to get rid of the liability for 3 years running. Jonah did not think about any of this. He thought about $412. He thought about how Lawrence Pruitt had walked away from everything with a clean balance sheet and a smug, carefully constructed silence. He thought about how the only thing he had ever wanted was to own something that no one could take a pen to and forge. His hand went up. 3,000, he said. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something slightly pitiful happens in public. Sold, the auctioneer said, not unkindly to the gentleman in the back. After fees and transfer taxes, Jonah walked out of the county building with the deed to a condemned grain elevator site and exactly $87 to his name. He drove south on Sycamore Road until the road turned to gravel, and when he reached the chain-link fence with its red danger, condemned signs, he parked and sat looking at what he'd bought. The collapsed section of the elevator leaned against what remained of the standing structure, a jagged concrete ruin that looked like a broken tooth. Pigeons had colonized the upper sections. Ragweed grew thick along the fence line. In the gap where a gate had once been, someone had welded a rusted steel plate with a padlock that Jonah was now legally allowed to open because he had paid $3,000 for the privilege of owning this disaster. You the one who just bought this wreck. He turned. A man in his mid-60s was walking along the fence line from the adjacent property, a scrubby pasture with a few Angus cattle standing in the shade of a cottonwood. He had a white beard trimmed short, a Carhartt cap with a sweat stain along the brim, and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who'd spent decades watching people make bad decisions. Pete Halverson, the man said, extending a rough hand. I own the 40 acres north of you. 31 years as a county fire marshal before I retired. And I'm going to assume, based on the fact that you just bought this eyesore, that you are either broke or crazy. Both probably, Jonah said. Pete studied him for a moment, then spat into the weeds. You know there's a basement under that thing, flooded. Has been since 19. County pumped it twice, gave up, fenced it. If one of my cows wanders through that gate and drowns, I'll be suing you. I don't have anything left to sue for. Pete's expression shifted slightly. The skepticism didn't disappear, but something behind it softened. Come over for coffee, he said. You look like you haven't eaten since last week. He wasn't wrong. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were survivable. Jonah slept in his truck on the Caldwell property, showered at the truck stop 2 miles up on Route 9, and took whatever work Pete offered, fence repairs, clearing brush, splitting wood. Pete paid in cash and didn't ask questions, which was its own kind of generosity. The locals thought Jonah was peculiar at best, a fool at worst. He was the stranger who'd bought the condemned ruin on Sycamore Road, and some people found that quietly amusing. Then the heat came. The summer of 2026 arrived in southern Iowa like something out of a century-old almanac. Brutal, unrelenting, drier than anything the old-timers could account for. By mid-July, the Harkers Mill Municipal Water Authority was under state advisory, its reservoir dropping 3 inches a week. The county issued emergency conservation orders. Farmers ran irrigation systems at night to avoid daytime restrictions, and the aquifer beneath the southern end of the county was being pumped at rates it wasn't designed to sustain. Jonah noticed the change at the Caldwell site first. The standing water in the grate near the collapsed foundation, a permanent feature since he'd arrived, began to recede. Not fast, but steadily, inch by inch, like a bathtub with a slow drain. By the first week of August, the grate was dry. By the second week, Jonah could see down into the utility stairwell for the first time, a concrete shaft descending 6 feet into what had been solid black water. He borrowed Pete's industrial flashlight and shone it down. The water level had dropped almost 4 feet. In the beam of light, the upper stairwell wall was exposed, marked with the white mineral stain of old water lines. At the bottom, where the water still pooled, something was visible that stopped him cold. A conduit run, thick galvanized steel pipe, the kind used in commercial construction when you're routing power to something that matters. And beside it, barely above the waterline, the corner of a poured concrete doorframe. He spent the next 4 days watching. The water kept dropping. By August 15th, the stairwell was walkable. Jonah waded down in rubber boots, water only ankle-deep now, and stood in front of the doorframe. A heavy steel door, commercial grade, sealed with a combination lock that had long since frozen with rust. The conduit disappeared through the wall beside it. Whoever had built this had run a dedicated power circuit to whatever was inside. That kind of deliberate infrastructure didn't happen by accident. He needed help. Specifically, someone with equipment to drain the last of the standing water and get through a rusted commercial door. Pete knew someone. Bruno Taft had served 8 years with the Army Corps of Engineers specializing in drainage and flood mitigation before a back injury ended his service. He'd settled near Harker's Mill a decade ago, doing excavation and municipal pump contracts. He was broad and laconic, with the permanent squint of a man who decided long ago that words were largely optional. "You want me to drain a flooded utility basement under a condemned grain elevator to open a door sealed since probably the Nixon administration," Bruno said, looking at the photos Jonah had printed at the library. "Yes." Bruno studied the conduit photograph for a long time. That's 3-inch galvanized. Someone ran a dedicated circuit to whatever's behind that door. He looked up. "I've got a diesel pump on my trailer. I can have that space dry in about 4 hours. A pause. "What do you figure is in there?" "I don't know," Jonah said, "but when the county condemned this site in 2019, they fenced it without ever fully draining the basement or inspecting what was below grade." Bruno's squint deepened into something close to interest. "Split whatever comes out of it." 60-40, Jonah said. "It's my land." "Fair enough," said Bruno. They ran the pump the following morning. Pete watched from the top of the stairwell, with his arms crossed while diesel smoke drifted across the ragweed. The water level in the utility basement dropped steadily, first exposing the cracked concrete floor, then the full face of the steel door, then something in the far corner of the room that the water had been hiding all along. A safe, not a small one, a freestanding Mosler industrial grade, the kind installed in commercial buildings in the 1970s. 4 feet tall, bolted to the floor slab with anchor bolts that had held against decades of flood and pressure without shifting a millimeter. The exterior was heavily corroded, but the door was sealed and the dial was intact. Bruno came down the stairwell and stood looking at it. "Mosler 400 series," he said quietly. Rated to withstand a building collapse, he glanced up at the ruin above them, which apparently this one did. Jonah was already moving toward it. His hands were an electrician's hands. They knew the difference between infrastructure that was incidental and infrastructure that was intentional. This safe was intentional. Someone had anchored it to poured concrete and run power to the room. Someone had sealed the door and not come back for it, or couldn't. That night he looked up the Caldwell Grain Company's history on his phone in Pete's kitchen. The company had been family-owned, founded in 1951. The last owner, a man named Howard Caldwell, had sold the elevator operation to a regional conglomerate in 2003 and died of a heart attack in 2011. The conglomerate had shuttered the elevator in 2017, sold the property in a bankruptcy liquidation. and the holding company that bought it had defaulted on county taxes, which was how Lot 11 had ended up at the auction. He found one more detail. Howard Caldwell's son-in-law, the man who had served as Caldwell Grain's operations manager for its final decade, was a man named Lawrence Pruitt. Jonah read the name twice, then a third time. He set the phone face down on Pete's table and sat very still for a long moment. Pete looked at him from across the kitchen. "What is it?" "The man who destroyed my life," Jonah said slowly, "used to run operations at the company that owned this property." Pete set his coffee cup down. "Then I'd suggest," he said, "that you open that safe before anyone else figures out what you've found." The combination lock was seized beyond casual manipulation, but Bruno had a more direct approach. 6 hours of penetrating oil, a borrowed impact wrench fitted with a custom adapter, and the kind of patient mechanical persistence that engineers learn or wash out. By 11 o'clock the following night, with a work lamp strung from the doorframe and moths circling the bulb, the Mosler's locking bolts retracted with a sound like a rifle shot. Jonah pulled the door open. The interior was bone dry. The safe seal had held against 30 years of humidity and flood cycles without failing. On the shelves, organized in hanging file folders yellowed but intact, were records, hundreds of them. Electrical inspection reports filed by county and by year, dating from 1998 through 2016, work permits. Contractor certifications. Sign-off documents bearing the stamps of county inspectors across 7 Iowa counties. Jonah pulled a folder at random and opened it. He knew what he was looking at within 30 seconds. Every report was falsified. Material specifications that didn't match the corresponding purchase orders clipped behind each report. Load calculations that didn't add up. Inspector signatures on projects 90 miles apart, dated the same day. A physical impossibility. And on every permit, on every certification, the name of the licensed electrician of record was consistent. Not Jonah Webb, Lawrence Pruitt, under his prior sole proprietorship license. Pruitt Electrical Services, operated before he'd ever approached Jonah about a partnership. Lawrence hadn't started the fraud with their business together. He'd been running it for years before Jonah existed in his orbit. Millhaven, the forged documents with Jonah's signature, the school fire, that had been Lawrence migrating a fraud he'd already perfected onto a younger man with a clean record and no idea what he'd walked into. Howard Caldwell had known. The records made it plain. A separate folder held internal memos on company letterhead documenting complaints about substandard electrical work on the elevator's loading systems, with terse responses from the operations manager, noting that the contractor had been fully certified and inspected by county authorities. Howard had preserved the paper trail quietly, systematically, the way a careful man preserves evidence he hopes he'll never need but knows he can't afford to lose. He'd died before he could use it. Lawrence had apparently known the records existed. He'd worked in this building long enough to know the subbasement storage room. He'd apparently assumed that when the elevator flooded and collapsed, whatever Howard had kept down there was gone. He'd been wrong. Jonah was still reading when Pete's voice came sharp from the top of the stairwell. Jonah, headlights on the road. Through the stairwell opening against the dark Iowa sky, he could see it, the pale wash of headlights, parked on the gravel access road at the edge of his property. 2 sets of them, neither moving. He gathered the folders, as many as he could carry, and climbed the stairwell. 2 black SUVs, engines running, parked just outside the chain-link gate. As Jonah emerged from the ruin, a figure stepped out of the lead vehicle, perhaps 50, in a suit jacket too heavy for August, with the particular expression of a man accustomed to conversations that ended exactly the way he wanted them to. "Mr. Webb," he said, his voice carrying easily across the dark. "My name is Alton Mercer. I represent a consortium of private interests with a historical claim to materials stored on this property. We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for the property and all its contents, effective immediately." That's a significant return on a $3,000 investment. No reasonable person declines that. Jonah stood at the edge of the collapsed concrete, the folders under his arm, Bruno beside him with a pry bar still in his hand. $50,000 would have sounded like salvation 6 months ago. "Who sent you?" Jonah asked. Mercer smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the answer doesn't matter. "Private interests." "Does Lawrence Pruitt know you're here?" The smile didn't change, but something behind it did, a slight recalibration. "Mr. Pruitt has no involvement." "Then you won't mind," Jonah said, "if I make a call." He pulled out his phone. His hands were steady. He'd spent 6 years working in spaces where one wrong connection caused a fire. He knew how to be steady when it mattered. "While you were driving out here," Jonah said, "I photographed every document in that safe. All of them. 17 years of falsified inspection reports, fraudulent contractor certifications, and a systematic bribery network across 7 Iowa counties. Those images are uploaded to a cloud server scheduled to distribute automatically to the Iowa Attorney General's office, the State Licensing Board, the Des Moines Register, and 4 federal regulatory agencies at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, unless I log in before then and cancel the send." Mercer's expression went very flat, very fast. "I'm an electrician," Jonah continued. "I understand circuits. You interrupt the source, the circuit opens. You interrupt me. The send goes out automatically. No human action required." He held up the phone now. "You're going to call Lawrence Pruitt. Speakerphone, and you're going to hand me that phone." For a long moment, nothing moved. The August crickets were deafening. Somewhere behind Jonah, Pete Halverson stepped out of the shadow of the ruin, and the sound he made. The unmistakable mechanical action of a pump-action shotgun being racked, carried across the gravel with complete clarity. 31 years as county fire marshal, Pete said pleasantly. "I've got all night and nothing to prove. So let's stand here nice and easy while the man makes his call." Mercer looked at the shotgun. He looked at Bruno's pry bar. He looked at Jonah. He took out his phone and dialed. The call connected on the second ring. "Is it handled?" Lawrence Pruitt's voice came through the speaker. Smooth, confident, the voice of a man who'd been getting away with things for a very long time. "Hello, Lawrence," Jonah said. The silence on the other end lasted almost 5 full seconds. "Jonah." The smoothness was gone. What replaced it was something tighter, more careful. "How did you?" "Howard Caldwell kept better records than you thought," Jonah said. 17 years of them. Everything. The falsified permits, the inspector payments, the material substitutions on 6 public school contracts, 2 hospital expansions, and a county courthouse renovation. Your signature is on all of it. The original fraud, the original license, all. Pruitt Electrical Services. I was just your exit strategy." Another silence, longer this time. "What do you want?" 3 things. Jonah kept his voice level. He'd lain awake thinking out this on a dozen consecutive nights when sleep wouldn't come. "First, you contact the Ohio Licensing Board by end of business tomorrow and submit a sworn statement correcting the record on the Millhaven School fire. Full responsibility. My license gets reinstated. Clean, no conditions. Second, you drop the remaining civil judgment against me. Completely. Third, you provide full documentation to the Iowa AG's office on the Inspector Payment Network. All of it. And if I don't? Then, at 8 tomorrow morning, 17 agencies get an early birthday present." Jonah looked out across the flat, dark Iowa land, at the stars very bright out here. "You've built something, Lawrence." "I know you have. It took you a long time and it cost other people a great deal, but the foundation under it was never concrete. And you know that better than anyone." The silence that followed was the longest of the night. When Lawrence finally spoke again, his voice was very quiet, stripped of all its usual architecture. "Send me the licensing board form," he said. "I'll sign it." 3 years later, Jonah's electrical contracting license was fully reinstated, his record clean, the civil judgment vacated, the correction filed with the Ohio board under Lawrence's signature as agreed. He didn't go back to Ohio. He stayed in Harker's Mill, where he built a small business doing agricultural electrical work across 3 counties: grain dryers, irrigation controls, solar installations for family farms cautiously moving into the modern era. He hired 2 men from town and paid them well. The Caldwell site he kept. The collapsed elevator was eventually demolished by a county contractor, the salvage value offsetting the cost. On the flat 8 acres that remained, Jonah built a modest shop building and a gravel equipment yard, practical, unglamorous, entirely his. Lawrence cooperated with the Iowa AG investigation in exchange for a negotiated settlement that kept him out of federal custody, but not out of the public record. His contracting license was permanently revoked across 3 states. 2 county inspectors lost their jobs. The story ran in the Des Moines Register and was picked up briefly by the national trade press. Lawrence moved somewhere quiet after that, and if anyone knew where, they weren't telling. Howard Caldwell's careful record-keeping, it turned out, had been an act of protection for his daughter, Lawrence's first wife, who'd divorced him in 2009. Howard had known exactly what his son-in-law was. He'd just run out of time to do anything about it himself. Pete Halvorson came by the new shop most Friday mornings for coffee, because the drive from his farm took 4 minutes, and the coffee was better than what he made himself. Bruno Taft did most of the heavy excavation subcontracting. They didn't talk about the night in the basement very often. There wasn't much to say about it that wasn't already obvious. Sometimes, on jobs that took Jonah past the Sycamore Road property, he'd glance at the tidy shop building standing where the ruin used to be, and he'd think about the version of himself who'd sat in that auction room with $87 and raised his hand for no reason he could fully explain. He'd thought he was buying an escape. He'd bought something else, a thread that, when pulled, unraveled the whole design laid over the last 6 years of his life. He never found out who tipped off Mercer that night. He had his suspicions, but suspicions were a luxury he'd learned to live without. What he knew was simpler. The records had survived because one careful old man had refused to let a lie go unwitnessed, and they'd stayed safe inside that Mosler through flood and collapse and years of silence, waiting for the right moment and the right person to come along and find them. So, here's what I want you to sit with. If you'd been in that auction room, broke and out of options, would you have raised your hand for the condemned ruin on Sycamore Road? Or would you have walked out and taken the sensible road? Maybe there's no right answer, but every now and then, the worthless thing nobody else wants turns out to be the only thing that was ever going to save you. If Jonah's story kept you watching, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Share this with someone who needs to hear that starting over isn't the same as giving up. And subscribe to Own the Drama, because we've got more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss what surfaces next.